Hey, Dave.
Hello, Derek. Dr.
Here we are.
Gabbie.
Here we are with another episode of Budget Committee! Exclamation point.
Yeah.
Where are we talking about today? Where are we venturing to?
Today, we're heading all the way over to Alaska, specifically Sitka Public Schools, Alaska. I got a request to look into the situation there at Sitka. And the request, which is usually, it comes in prose. Usually it's like, oh, this is happening in my district. But this was just a series of links.
Oh,
Series
wow.
of news articles and a link to a public meeting, a recording of a public meeting of the Sitka Public Schools. So Alaska is a very different context, like geographically and also fiscally. And there's some really interesting stuff going on here. All the time thinking about Sitka, I was just thinking about the skit from Saturday Night Live, you know, the Bears, and they talk about
Yes.
Hurricane Ditka.
Yes. There we go.
Coach Ditka. But here we have Sitka. But that's probably, I hope that...
You're doing a great Chicago accent. This is perfect.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Apologies to the people of Sitka, the good people of Sitka. And is that even how one pronounces it? Do you know?
I don't know.
I find looking at these school districts, like how one pronounces things, it's actually very specific. Like, and it's easy to get it wrong. Yeah.
This is a total side point, but I think about that a lot. Having gone to grad school in Iowa, there's a bike route called the World Tour of Iowa, where you are biking between all the towns that are named for other world capitals, but none of them are pronounced that way. Like there's so New Madrid, for instance. It's
Madrid.
It's funny.
Well, we have Berlin, Connecticut.
Yeah, exactly. We have a Berlin, Wisconsin. Yeah,
Berlin, Wisconsin. Yeah, yeah. That's really funny. I mean, it's sort of interesting. Part of this work is, you know, we're flying into these places to some degree, and I always think about like the local, like as a category. It's a very strange category because obviously every single place is local. Like anything that isn't like the state or the federal or the international, it's just a set of local places. It is just, you know, every single place is local, but there's sort of a barrier after which you pass where the language games, the things that people know, the culture, but also the political economy becomes extremely differentiated past that point. And so we transgress those boundaries a little. We pass through those boundaries here.
And we were talking about this a little bit off air, how weird that is. Again, you know, I live in a place, I've lived in Wauwatosa, Wisconsin for since 2020. And I got super into the school finance picture of what was going on here. And yet it seemed to me, I live here, I know people here, I attend board meetings, I see all the documents, and there would still be things that I am discovering piece by piece about how we have structured our debt, what the particular history of this particular decision is. And so I am very aware every time we talk about the situation that another place is experiencing, about like, I can see the documents. I can see a lot of background information about what's going on here. I can understand at a macro level some of the history, but I am very aware of how much there is that we are not touching on in each one of these episodes, and how much decisions that don't look like they make sense to me from an outsider's perspective might have a curious sort of local logic to them as well.
And it can sometimes work in the reverse. It's actually a kind of contradictory situation where you're so immersed in the local that you actually can't see things that might be right in front of you because you're so immersed there. And so someone coming from the outside looking at the documents from that, you could call it maybe a structural point of view, as a way of asking questions. That's why I try to formulate a lot of this stuff in terms of questions that I know that the people in that terrain could answer or pursue, that I know that I don't have all of the information on, but I'm seeing something, you know, that maybe they're not seeing. Because I know, you know, when you're immersed in a very local situation, you can be blinded to it. But there is an element too, and I experienced this in Philadelphia where I started learning about all this myself. It's where I started really getting into the weeds to try to figure out, how school buildings are financed and like, there's an element, and particularly being in Philly, but also all kinds of places are like this. Almost every place, people have, if you start talking about their city, you start talking about their culture, you start talking about their terrain, their landscape. I'm thinking of that meme, Will Smith, telling Chris Rock, get her name out of your mouth.
Yeah.
It's like they want you to get the name of their place out of your mouth if you're talking about it. And I understand that too, but they also really want people to be talking about it. They want more coverage, they want more analysis to be able to think about how to transform it. And there's this interesting ambivalence there. So, but maybe we should get into Sitka. I mean,
let's talk about it. Yeah.
Let's talk about, if we're pronouncing it right. The good people there can correct us. I did post a TikTok on this, and there are some interesting comments. Nobody corrected my pronunciation. So
it's great.
Derek, do you want to, I feel like you have a good handle on the kind of, what we could call the basics of the kerfuffle, the fundament of the boo-boo, the budget boo-boo that's going on here.
Yes. Well, okay. And let's build up from the budget boo-boo. I like that way of sort of framing it.
The boo-boo method.
Exactly. The Sitka, the school district, is facing essentially a budget shortfall, like many school districts are in our contemporary day and age across the United States and elsewhere for that matter. It's always tempting for me to try to quantify like how big of a deal something is, relatively speaking, and I want to resist that because every shortfall is a shortfall that will have to be dealt with, and however it is dealt with tends to be painful. But the basic situation in Sitka from the district level is that in March of this past year, a fiscal year 27 budget projected a $1.2 million deficit, period. That's the first fact. Yeah. They also suggested that a 10% health insurance increase, like cost increase, could push that all the way to $2 million. Then like 3 weeks later, it came out, this is all from KCAW, so like news coverage, that there was an $800,000 accounting error due to, as you said in your TikTok, basically the fact that the district was doing its budgeting on Excel spreadsheets. And so suddenly this projected $1.2 million deficit is almost $3 million. It's $2.8 million deficit. The superintendent suggested that a rush timeline was partly to blame for this accounting error, but there was also staff turnover in the school business office, which, as you have noted in particular in the past,
always.
Yeah, that's how these errors tend to happen. So in response, so let's start there. That's the biggest issue, is that there's this $3 million budget shortfall. Obviously, districts have to balance their books. And what a budget shortfall usually means in the immediate short term is reductions, cuts. And because
firings.
Of the way that, yeah, exactly. Because of the way that school budgets are structured, where the overwhelming majority of expenditures are on staff, it means that cuts mean cutting people. There's not a lot of wiggle room for districts in the immediate short term to distribute that pain to other areas of the budget. So initially, the board looked like it was going to have to, or there were discussions of cutting up to 16 positions. And what has ended up happening is basically 8.5 FTE positions, including 4.25 teachers. So the note, a bigger structural point here is that what districts tend to do when they are facing a structural deficit and they have to make cuts, they have to cut personnel, but they will keep those cuts away from teachers to the greatest possible extent. Teachers make up in almost every district, obviously, the majority of the personnel that they have. So it's meaningful here that half of the positions that are cut are teachers, which means that disproportionately, even at this small number of positions that are being cut, disproportionately cuts are falling on staff. And that is also a pattern that we see when people have to, that is non-teaching staff. Those would be literacy coaches, paraprofessionals, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, a couple points here just that I think are interesting to consider. First thing about the deficit, like public school districts are not like they're any whether the deficit's 500,000 or 3 million. You don't want to come up short. Like and the thing that we're up to in the public school district, it's public provision of education. It's not the manufacturing of widgets or what have you. And so when you have a deficit, it's not like, we had a bad quarter,
Yeah.
or something. It's not, I don't think the same business logics apply, even though they tend to be applied in this way. So even if it sounds small, relatively speaking, it's still a big problem. And the second factor here is that, in education, most of the operating expenditures go towards salaries and benefits. I mean, it's like upwards of 80, 90%.
Yeah.
And so it's a people thing. There's a labor theory of value in education. Something I like to say, which is that it's all human labor. I mean,
Yeah.
education can't happen without, they try to make it happen without the people, and now they're doing the AI thing with the rockets, whatever. But it's such a human thing, and so it comes to bear on humans when the money falls short. And, when it happens in these situations, it's almost like when you were talking, I had this image of plate tectonics, just like small sedimentary breakings away of these plates, and it's happening all over this country, which is part of the reason why we're doing this podcast. Because I think at some point you'll see an earthquake, at the larger level, but it's happening in all these little areas, right? Sitka schools, there, sort of west of Juneau, Alaska.
Yeah. I mean, plate tectonics is a great metaphor, a great way to think about all these different plates moving against each other, moving apart.
Yeah.
And one of the aspects of thinking about local school politics and school finance with this plate tectonic metaphor is that people tend not to think of it in this plates moving kind of way. And what that means for local communities is that they are very rarely in a position to really stand back and be like, do we want to drift in this direction? Do we want to make these trade-offs as opposed to these trade-offs? I keep using that term, and I know that there's better ones, but do we want to do this, or do we want to do that? And can we have a conversation about what it is that we want out of this system, period?
Right. And what if we did this? Like, what if, nobody thought a certain direction was possible, and then maybe you could go in that direction?
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to consider those possibilities. It does feel like you're caught up in the only issue. And I have a tendency to make natural metaphors biological or metaphors of nature, but this is nothing is natural here. It's all social, right? It's all society. We can direct history. It's overwhelming, but it's not as though we're caught in some natural process necessarily. So we should being able to know what direction the forces are all pushing and where the larger things are happening and where you can help locate yourself and figure out how to maneuver. And
that's right.
I don't know if you're seeing any maneuverings. I mean, how would you locate the tension and forces going on here?
I was going to be like, that's the perfect transition is to talk about these forces. Sitka is we're talking about one particular school district, but every school district in Alaska, just like every school district in any given state, is subject to forces that are outside of its control, within which it has to make particular decisions about how many staff members get cut or which budgeting software to use or anything of that nature. And so Alaska has a very unique way of funding its schools that it owes a great deal to its own sort of unusual history of statehood, its geography, its particular abundance of natural resources, its racialized categories, etc.
Indigenous.
Maybe we should talk about that stuff a little bit. That is the way that Alaska as a state funds its schools, because it is not on the basis of like it's not as reliant on either local property taxes or especially a state level tax in the same way that other states are.
Yeah, go into it. How does it happen?
Well, let's talk about it. So, like other states, it has a kind of foundation formula is how each district is funded. And that, just like a lot of other states, is based on the enrollment, most fundamentally, that any district has. The Alaska's K-12 funding runs through something called the base student allocation. That is the per pupil dollar amount that the state will guarantee. And that formula is exactly the base student amount times the adjusted number of students in a district. And like some other states that we have talked about before, this is weighted by a couple of factors. Small schools get more weight per student. District costs play a role. Alaska is an enormous state, and so some districts have exaggerated transportation costs that factors into stuff. Students with special needs carry additional weight. Districts that are doing particular things with career and technical education that the state would like to see get additional weight, et cetera. And each district is also there's a cost differential that goes sort of the other way for like home or correspondence students that the district is supporting. Those count as slightly less than one student for enrollment purposes, or for the way that this is allocated. So the state will be they'll take this base student allocation, they will factor in all these weights, they will multiply it by the number of students, and that is the amount of funding to which that school or for which that school is eligible. Then there is a local contribution that is made, and that is just subtracted from what the state's promise is, and the state supplies the rest. But there's two things about that. The first thing is that the state supply comes out of the state's general fund, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail about where that state revenue comes from, because it's basically oil proceeds, rather than like a state level tax. And the second thing is that foundation formula, or the total basic student allocation, is set at the state level. And the state held that level flat between 2017 and 2023, roughly, despite the fact that the consumer price index in Alaska, so the cost of food and healthcare and everything, rose by 25% over that same time. So districts are not entitled to any additional public money, whether from local or state sources, or from the two combined, over this at the same time as costs are rising exponentially. So Sitka finds itself in this budgetary, between a budgetary rock and a hard place, in part because, like every district, they've been trying to keep their costs within the amount of funding revenue, basic public revenue, that they are entitled to. That's that's the big sort of structural picture. And we can go into the politics more of that later. It is essentially the legislature kept trying to raise that, and the governor kept vetoing it because the governor wanted to make it hinge on a couple of things that will be very familiar to people who follow school politics a lot. Until he wanted to tie it to some kind of performance pay, essentially until outcomes improve, we're not giving the schools any more money, and also wanted to tie it to, a more widespread availability of school choice things, generally speaking. The irony there for me, and this is the last comment that I'm going to make before I throw it back to you, is that, I mean, spending way more time in the school finance weeds has really has turned me into this fiscal conservative where school choice is concerned, where I'm suddenly wait, this is supposed to be a good thing for the way that we invest in education. We're distributing roughly the same amount of money
Yeah.
across a much larger set of institutions. This is wildly inefficient. We're going to end up like underfunding education for everyone.
Yeah.
My God, this is just, yeah. That's my fiscal conservatism with respect
It's weird.
to choice
It's you get tied in knots. I mean, and to some degree, the fiscal conservatives, in terms of their small government and their this and their that, was always a cover, for just like a more militarized capitalism. I mean, it's so maybe it just sort of reveals itself there. But it's interesting because the portrait you're painting of the funding sort of landscape in terms of the technical, the technics, we could call it, of the situation. It's almost like, and the vibe I was also getting when looking into, I just went really deep into the bond bank and the permanent fund, which I can talk about. But, like, it's almost like we have some kind of libertarian frontier social democracy, like resource wealthy. There's more of there's more of a sense of centralization in Alaska, paired and juxtaposed with this sort of imaginary of rugged individualism. That itself also, this whole debate, about Greenland and Trump being like, oh, we're going to take Greenland and wanting to be like McKinley. Well, who was the guy that got Alaska as a state? It was McKinley, right? I mean, in some ways, that's sort of, we're living in the like Alaska's past, is our immediate future in this way. Right. Like, at least in terms of those fantasies, that at least, I don't know where they're coming from in that fascist coalition, but somebody is bringing them to the fore. But like, so we have these structures, and so you find this sort of combination. You could call it a volatile combination. I don't know, a combination of like, we're in this together, social contract, almost kind of redistributive tendencies in the policies, combined with this very individualistic, conservative set of vibes and policies. And we see that again in these two structures that I looked at, which I don't know, in terms of my own sense of like, on TikTok, whatever, what I wanted to just sort of say, to get people thinking, and then see how that resonated. The extent to which these things are or not involved is unclear, although I did get some confirmation, in fact, that the permanent fund, the Alaska Permanent Fund, is indeed at the center of the debates around financing public education in Alaska at this moment. So let's talk a little bit about that first. So the Alaska Permanent Fund is the only sovereign wealth fund in the United States that exists at the state level. And a sovereign wealth fund is just when it's basically like the state. And I mean, when I say the state, I don't mean the state of Alaska necessarily, although in this case I do. I mean generally the state, the apparatus that has a monopoly on violence. In this territory, like in this case, the state government, or the middle layer of government that we have in the United States. Like, it basically has its own investment fund. It's a public investment fund. It's a set of monies that are managed by the government, invested. The returns come back into the fund, and the fund is subject to the will of the state apparatus to some degree. I think Alaska, and the stuff that I was reading, likes to talk a big game about how it finances the lives of the citizens of Alaska. It's all about democracy, and nothing gets done without a vote, and da-da-da-da-da. But I think obviously that's a fantasy, that or a horizon. It's aspirational. But the Alaska Permanent Fund, it doesn't sound like much, right? It just sounds like a savings account or something. But actually, this is a sovereign wealth fund that's worth, did I say $64 billion? I think I saw. I don't know if I think it's somewhere in the 60s billion.
Okay.
And places that are known for having sovereign wealth funds are places that are oil-rich countries, like Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund, or Norway's sovereign wealth fund. These are places that use the state to and their resource wealth to make decisions about how to invest. And the reason why that's so unique in the United States context is because we have nothing like that anywhere else in this country. I mean, there are little pockets here and there, maybe, but and definitely things that could become that at the state level or at the federal level, but no one's gone ahead and done it. And here we have Alaska. I think since the 1970s, the permanent fund has been in place. And the permanent fund, it operates in a couple really interesting ways. One of the most visible ways in Alaska is, along with being the only sovereign wealth fund we have in the U.S., it's also the only long-term actually existing basic income program that we have in the United States. It provides something called the permanent fund dividend to every individual every year. Now, it's not that much money. Maybe it's $1,000, $1,600 or something like that. But it is basic income that comes from the state and goes right to individuals. And the permanent fund itself is coming out of the oil money. Like this is an oil state. Alaska is, and I think that that's really important. But I did see some comments very recently about debates about what's to become of the permanent fund because that oil isn't flowing in the same way that it was. There's a bit of a scarcity coming in from the flows there, and it's never been for sure how much this oil was gonna flow or not. And so now there's big debates about, how to turn Alaska, into a, I can't remember the phrase that I saw on one website. It's like from an oil state to a service state or something like that, so that the permanent fund actually becomes, it's not just about like, oh, how do we spend our oil money and can we just, peg ourselves to the oil petrodollar, but how do we actually, just commit ourselves to serving the people, whether the revenues are oil or not. And but the other thing about the permanent fund, not the other thing, but another thing about permanent fund that's relevant for us is not only individuals get allotments of money in the form of, in the case of the PFD, the dividend, a form of a dividend, but municipalities have allotments of investments that throw off interest. And those investments can be used by the municipality. So now some of them are spendable and others are not spendable. And in the case of Sitka, we have about $26 million of their government activity in their audits that is set aside from the Alaska Permanent Fund. Okay, so they have $26 million of investments allotted to them now we're talking about the city and borough of Sitka, not the school district of Sitka. Now, because the schools, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think the schools are managed by the city and borough. It seems like the schools are a creature, in this case, of the municipality. Sometimes the school district is its own creature or relatively autonomous from a municipality, and other times there's more concentric kinds of ways of doing this. It seems to me in Alaska, you have what you have, for instance, in Massachusetts, where you have, school committees that are part of the town council rather than a separate situation. So
that is right here.
So Sitka has its permanent fund allotment, and in the accounting line items, you'll see two lines. One is non-spendable and one is spendable. And lion's share of these investments are not spendable, which is to say, like, Sitka can just go ahead and spend $25 million on whatever it wants. However, the interest generated from this allotment, which are invested, is spendable, and it turns out that the spendable amount for Sitka is $1.04 million, which then led me to the question of whether or not the city and borough of Sitka would be interested in allotting some of the spendable permanent fund money to the problems for their schools, but there's also a ton of other projects that the city and borough is engaged in infrastructurally, which gets us to the bond bank. So I want to talk a little bit about that too.
Let me break in real quickly before you go to the bond bank thing. So what makes Alaska really unique is the idea of this permanent fund, which exists for the purpose of the state generally. But the idea of permanent funds for schools is a much older idea. Lots of states have or have had permanent school funds. It was part of the deal that Jefferson was promoting in the Northwest Ordinances at the end of the 18th century. The idea being that the federal government was effectively, through violence, going to clear land of indigenous people and then grant that to settlers, to new territorial governments, with the requirement I remember very clearly being in grad school and, TAing for my advisor's lectures in the foundations of education. And he had this very romantic way of describing this sort of thing about like the idea of the public schools was that within one of these townships that was established in the Northwest Territory, you had to designate this one square for a place called school, as he would say, section 16, I think it was. Uh, and that was evidence of a national commitment to carrying education forward as the nation expanded westward and all that kind of stuff.
There's
But
that Horace Mann stuff.
Exactly. But the thing about land being set aside for schools is that for a lot of these states, there's still 20 permanent education funds within states, is that it basically is doing what Alaska's doing at a statewide level, not specifically for education, but in these other states, it's specifically for education. You take land that is granted by the federal government and you use sales or proceeds from that land to support your permanent education fund. So Wisconsin, where I live, has had one of those. In Texas, which is the largest of these that still remain, that fund, again, throws off interest, and that interest is used to cover certain expenditures, such as in Texas specifically, it's like textbooks and stuff. They will cover like district level purchases. It doesn't provide much of a district's annual budget, and so it is sort of faded from consciousness. But this general idea that what's going to happen is the federal government is going to take over a piece of land and then require either the federal government itself or a state government, when it's establishing a state like Wisconsin did, for instance, is going to establish a permanent education fund that is fueled by value thrown off from these lands. So like if we think about property value, the local property tax, for instance, as one way in which education is tied to the value of land, this is the other way that education is tied to the value of land and its resources. The three current biggest education funds by state are Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. And those are all because of the massive natural resource outputs associated with each one of those states. That's the only thing that I want to bring up.
Yeah, no, I think it's really important. I always think of the literary fund in Virginia. I think I think it's small quantitatively, but qualitatively, I think it's one of the oldest because of that legacy of Jefferson's. And to have it be called the literary fund, I always thought was sort of fun. It's true. They have these permanent funds. And just to riff slightly on what you were saying, the ways in which education is tied to colonialism is very intimate in the story that you're telling, because if a colony, after the revolution, after these were then states, and the states were pushing westward, if you wanted to establish a new state or an extent, or for instance, like the reason why Case Western is called Case Western in Cleveland is because it was the western border of Connecticut. But to be able to establish yourself in that way as a settler and get resources from the federal government, it was required that you set aside this land for education, and then you could get other federal resources and the land that was set aside for schools, and then the ways in which it was governed through something like a school district. That was also required, and that was based on the Massachusetts Bay sort of people, the Puritans and their model from the old Duluth century earlier. Their model of the school committee being coming about in the 1650s. They just sort of took with and ran with that model. That's how we have the system we have today, is this quilt, as Mike Glass puts it, of the historian of 13,000 school districts. The district model that was developed by those sort of extremist Christian settlers was then exported, and it was incentivized in that way. But we don't have permanent funds, and a lot of times, like a permanent fund at the state level in the form of a sovereign wealth fund is a very sort of like a centralized, it's almost a kind of European approach to subnational finance or national finance. And another thing that's also infrequent that we have in Alaska, which is a surprising kind of social democratic redistributive functions of a state that is also rugged individual and libertarian, is the bond bank. There's only 13 bond banks in the country, the first one being Vermont's, I think, from the late 60s. And what a bond bank does is, I think it's a smart idea, right? Where, like, if a set of schools need to be built, you have a school district that need to borrow to be able to pay for the construction. What we tend to do in the country by vast majority, is that school district or municipality has to borrow to be able to do it. And so they take on the risk of the project itself, the financial risk. What it means to take on that risk is essentially that they're the ones who have to pay the principal and the interest and all the fees associated with that credit to be able to build the schools that they want to do. They're on the line. So, after the early 20th century, when it became more common to have local control, that is to say, the local levying property taxes or whatever, like, if you don't have a lot of taxable land within the boundaries of your school district, it's a very risky thing for you to do, such that you might not even borrow, and so you might not build schools.
Mm-hmm.
But so what we do in that case is, like, this is a line I get from sociologist Mike McCarthy's book on pension funds. What's the apportionment of social risk, the allocation of the social risk of the provision of a thing. In this case, the provision of school infrastructure, school facilities. How do we do that? There's usually one of two options. There's either sort of market-oriented, individualistic way, or a solidaristic way. That's his distinction that I really like. And typically in this country, it's highly market-oriented, highly individualistic. Every school district sort of dog eat dog, out for themselves. But in some places, they have programs that make it less so, that are slightly more solidaristic. And that's what a bond bank does. So instead of Sitka, Ketchikan, Chatham, all these, school districts in that area, instead of them having to go out on their own and take on the risk of borrowing, the Alaska Municipal Bond Bank says, how about this? What we'll do is we'll take your project and your project and your project from all these different places, and we're going to roll them all up, and we're going to sell a municipal bond through the bond bank to finance all of them, and then we'll allot based on what you need, and we'll work with you in terms of repayment. You'll pay us on terms that we can kind of configure, and they help, I would say to some degree, get in between the school district and the cruel vicissitudes of the market. So you actually have someone who's looking out for your interests on that market, so that you're not just swept up in whatever wave happens to hit at the moment. Now they're not cure-alls, but at least what it does is it to some degree solidarizes the risk entailed in borrowing money for infrastructure.
And that is also, I don't know enough about either bonding or about Texas, which I'm about to talk about in order to like make this work. But Texas does have something that is similar, that is supported by its permanent school fund. But instead of the bond bank, and on my understanding, rolling up all these projects together, the bond bank essentially stands like Billy Zane and Zoolander behind each individual school district and is like, no, all of these school districts are going to be treated as AAA investments, so districts are still borrowing on their own in the marketplace, but they're doing it at the lowest level of risk possible, which means
the exposure is less.
Yes, the exposure is less there. And what it means is that they are paying less for their bonding expenses. And that is the thing that is freeing up operational dollars for use in schools. It's a slightly different model, but it's the same basic idea. We have this permanent fund, and we're going to use that to institutionalize a sort of leveling of risk across all districts in the state.
I think that's right. I don't know as much about the Texas Texas one, but that sounds right to me. It's the Billy Zane model. I think that's a good name for it.
Like it. Yeah.
And but in Alaska, it's more like everybody on the bus. I'm thinking about, all the districts get on the same bus,
Yeah.
and the state and the municipal bond bank is the bus driver. And rather than everyone needing to get their own individual cars and pay their own individual car insurance and pay all of their fees and take on the risk of transportation themselves, we have a bit more of a solidaristic situation where we have a bus. Now it's interesting because when I want to find out about anything about school finance, my first move is to go to the electronic municipal market access dashboard. It's almost like sometimes I'm an MSRB commercial, but I always say it's Emma time, and I go and this time I actually went. I never did this before, but I wanted to try. I went live on TikTok, and I was like, oh, I'm going to do this live, and I'm just going to see if I get lost or I can't find it, whatever. Maybe people will be interested. Like 20 people were watching me like poke around Emma. Couldn't find a single mention of Sitka. I mean, I know that's not true. I found 3 solitary mentions of Sitka, all of which were older issuance pages from the 80s, 70s. It's like I saw a line from 1969. I always wish there were documents associated with them, but I think it's just, they're never documents, but couldn't find word one about Sitka in a contemporary, meaningful sense. Which, just pausing there for a second, the reason why is because Sitka doesn't have to become a borrower on the municipal bond market for its schools. Because why? Because to find up-to-date information about Sitka's borrowing in the municipal bond market, I had to come upon the Alaska Municipal Bond Bank's issuer page, go into a recent general obligation bond issuance, and then search for Sitka. And lo and behold, we have Sitka along with all these other municipalities who have different different projects, different things that they're involved in through the bond bank. And like what Derek just said, particularly because small districts, small municipalities generally have a rougher time in the municipal bond market. And there's actually a really good Brookings paper co-authored by one of the directors of the Vermont Bond Bank from 2024, when they make a really great case for the bond bank. I mean, a lot of school districts get screwed. Sometimes they're paying 10% just on their costs of issuance. For bonds, because they're like a tiny little creature approaching a huge canyon to try to get what they need just for their little needs. And they get taken advantage of. They're overwhelmed. There's a lot of knowledge asymmetries, ton of issues here. And when you have a bond bank to help you out, a bus you can get on to navigate the canyon, then it helps. So to find out stuff about Sitka, I had to do that. So we have the Alaska Municipal Bond Bank. So I think all of this, just trying to paint this portrait, like, I think what I'm taking away are 2 things. One, like, the situation in Sitka could be so much worse if these things were not in place. Like, we can debate about the permanent fund and we can debate about the bond bank, this and that, but like, I think that their deficit would be maybe 10 times greater if they were fully exposed to the municipal bond market on the one hand, and on the other hand didn't have backup from the permanent fund in this more solidaristic way. But the second thing I already mentioned, which is that, because there's this permanent fund, like, can we Oh, well, actually, it operates in each one creates a possibility. The permanent fund creates the possibility of using spendable monies thrown off from the interest of the municipal allocations of the investments to potentially push towards public education. And the bond bank, well, if the bond bank is more of this bus model, less the Billy Zane model, but more of this bus model, then the bond bank, could we renegotiate the terms of some of this borrowing to try to free up some monies here? The only other thing I'll say about all this is that Sitka is involved in pretty large infrastructure projects in its harbor and in some dams that are providing hydroelectric energy. And because, the schools are not relatively autonomous, it's true, it's not clear that the municipality of Sitka, the city and the borough, are going to be interested in using that permanent fund spendable money for schools, or if the bond bank is going to be interested in negotiating with them on school spending. But
Mhm.
yeah, I just think people need to know about this stuff and appreciate it. Like we'll talk about Vermont. Like
Yeah.
this is cool. Like I mean, not everyone has this, and they
Mhm.
wish they had this. And I mean, I think most people don't even know that they should wish they had this.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to talk about.
That's right. I mean, when I hear you say like most people don't even know that they should wish that they had something like this, I think about the way that I'm constantly working with school districts who are thinking about doing some sort of construction project, and
Sure.
they go to their communities and they're asking like, "Hey, listen, here are our needs. Are these systems in the high school have reached the end of their usable life? Blah blah blah. Replacing. We need." Here are the options in front of us. We could remodel, that'll be $123 million, or we could build from scratch, that'll be less than that, let's say $100 million or something like that. But all of these figures are based on two things. One is the construction cost, and the second is the borrowing cost. And like those are rolled up into these one numbers, and they're just presented as the cost. And, community members in every community are like, why is it so expensive? Why couldn't it be cheaper? Can we bid these out sort of locally? But they're thinking about the construction piece of it and not the bonding piece of it, because obviously
Yep.
every district has to borrow in order to do any kind of large scale construction. Nobody's operating budget has room to do that. And every community will be like, why can't you have done the responsible thing and set money aside? And I'm like, this is a $100 million project. Like, what do you want to do? Set aside $1 million from your budget every year for a century? Like, in order to, like, what are we talking about? So borrowing is the way to do it, but borrowing costs don't have to be what they are necessarily. Like, there are systems in place that are in place in lots of different states that could ameliorate those costs a little bit.
Yeah,
The other
that's
thing that I
right.
want to say, transitioning back to Sitka in its current budget crisis. So like the bond bank, the permanent fund plays a role in the sort of annual operational funding that Sitka gets, but there's two pieces that we also need to talk about. One is the required local contribution. I've mentioned this already as like, the state says, here's the amount of money that it takes to educate all the students in your district according to this formula. You chip in your local money. We will subtract that from this basic allotment, and then the state will make up the rest. That's how the foundation formula sort of works, aside from, and federal dollars are extra on top of that. But this required local contribution. So what happens when the allocation has been flat for a long time, when the state's calculation of what an adequate education costs is artificially low over time? It means that within normal procedures, districts cannot raise the amount of money that they need in order to actually cover things like transportations or teacher salaries. They can't cover the actual costs of educating the kids that they have.
Right.
So most states have some form of overriding the system, generally
Yeah.
by contributing or by like,
Waivers, overrides.
yes, levy votes, bond levies, whatever, in order to get a community to up its local contribution. In Alaska, in particular, there have been this has been one of the big political debates recently, partly spurred by the fact that all the districts in Alaska are experiencing the same flatlining calculation of what adequate schooling costs. And it's not clear where this is going. There's several bills that have been proposed and defeated and then re-proposed, but the 2026 Alaska legislature has now capped annual required local contribution increases at 4%. So in a very typical way, legislatures are trying to protect property taxes, essentially, by capping those at something like the rate of inflation. But because the way that politics around this kind of stuff works, it's not a major issue until we're already way behind the adequate cost of education. So inflation has been going on since 2017, obviously,
Yeah.
but the cost, the allocation has been flat. Now it's a crisis, and the legislature is going to respond by allowing in quotation marks, local communities to up their own contributions, but they're going to cap that at the rate of inflation starting now. So you're already behind. Now
Yeah.
you can increase things, but not too much and never enough to actually catch up.
And isn't that an issue in Wisconsin as well? I mean, it's
Yes.
an issue
Yeah.
all over the place in Michigan too, where you have these caps
Yes.
to the rate of inflation, but that means that you can't actually tax to fund what you want as
Right.
much anymore. And then there are big debates over these thresholds, what the number should be, sometimes down to the like 100th decimal point.
Yeah.
About, you know, where that a lot of, I feel like a lot of politics, you know, actually comes down to what this 10th or 100th place of a decimal point is going to be on a spending threshold for some kind of state formula to help a municipality.
That's right.
US.
It's like the most minute, concrete point of like these big theoretical conflicts between like how much of this should be a state responsibility, or how much say should a state have over how a community conducts education, and how much authority should a local community have in order to fund its students. And there isn't like for me anyway, I'll just speak personally, a right or wrong way for that to go. Most states have some sort of equalization formula in which there's paying into a general state fund that then is redistributed sort of according to need, however that is calculated. And those kinds of equalization formulas tend to penalize really high property wealth districts specifically, so that they can't just decide on their own to outspend everyone else, which they would otherwise absolutely have the capacity to do. So like, it's complicated is what I'm saying. But specifically in Alaska, like Sitka is in this situation in which there is a budget deficit, and although it may seem intuitively as though like certainly there's like a local override you could use to get out of this, there isn't necessarily, or at least it's not going to be like a one-shot
it's not like that
solution.
Now, I think this is a good transition to start talking a little bit about the politics of the situation that are sort of emerging, at least that I'm getting in responses on TikTok. Before I do that, I just wanted to mention one other thread here that I was surprised by, and that is the Secure Rural Schools line item from the federal government, which is not a revenue stream that I was familiar with until looking into the school district, which it featured quite prominently in the reporting. The leadership of the school district in Sitka said, "Listen, we've spent all of our Secure Rural Schools money," and I was like, "Wait, what is that?" Turns out that the U.S. Forest Service gets an allotment to provide monies to school districts that are surrounded by federal lands. And because those federal lands are not subject to the property markets, they cannot be taxed in the same way. But when you can't tax the land that is in your school district, then you do not have money to provide public education through the typical means. And so the federal government, through the Forestry Service, has come in through the Secure Rural Schools funding. And there was legislative reauthorization of the Secure Rural Schools Act in last year. And I thought it was sort of an interesting, feature. Like, to me, I thought to myself, okay, hold on. Did they reauthorize this? Did they cut this? Because the fascists are always saying, and the Department of Education and public schools, cut this, cut that. And a lot of times they shoot themselves in the foot, because a lot of their basis of support is rooted in these rural areas where the only provision of education is going to be that public school district. And so that's why the voucher programs are actually like, they break up. This is Jennifer Berkshire talks all about this all the time. They break on the rocks of the actual base of support of the Republican Party, because they want to keep those schools. They don't want to just like generate McDonald's storefront schools of any kind. But I digress. In what we have actually was a successful reauthorization of the federal line item of the Secure Rural Schools money that Sitka was using. But because they had this boo-boo from using archaic Excel documents for their budgeting process, they had to use that federal money in a way that I don't think that they were anticipating.
That's right.
But,
in fact, because real quickly on the Secure Rural Schools Fund, it lapsed officially in 2023 and was just reauthorized.
Yes.
And upon the reauthorization, the federal government provided these funds to districts who qualify, including back payments. And ordinarily in Alaska, because the municipality and the district are one thing, they split that 50-50 ordinarily. But here, because the district was facing particular financial straights, the city was just like, no, 100% of this is going to the school district, and it's still not enough.
It's still not enough. It's still not enough because and that forestry money actually doesn't just go to schools. It goes to all kinds of things
Yes.
that are financed through this way. That's the federal government trying to come back and try to be a slightly compensatory, which is not something that the federal government in the United States tends to do for schools, though in this case it's still not enough. But getting to the politics, I think
Yes.
it's interesting to note that there's a dynamic happening, apparently, and I'm getting this from comments on TikTok, that there is a lot of debate about what to do with permanent fund money,
Mm.
but not the municipal allocation, not the spendable municipal allocation. That seems like a more kind of esoteric area of permanent funds. The thing that all the Alaskans, I think, really know about is the dividend from the permanent
Yeah.
fund, the check that they get in the mail every year. And so there's a big debate, actually, about returning to an older formula for the distribution of the dividend, and that's being argued by conservatives. Now, what
Interesting.
happens when you have solidaristic fiscal structures like this, you get totally different political spectra. I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
because it reshapes the contours of the debate, which is why, like in my book, I tried to open with the image of changing the terrain, changing the game. Because when you intervene in these fiscal structures, you can change the very terms of the game and the debate and the terrain that you're playing on against what right wing and left wing even mean. In this
Yes.
case,
Yes.
the right wing is arguing for a higher permanent fund dividend. And one of the ways they argue for this is homeschooling. They want to justify the homeschooling movement wants to increase the dividend that comes out of the permanent fund so that people can school their own kids, which would suck money away from the state appropriations for public schools. And so there's a debate raging right now that someone told me about in the comments about that. And I think that was mostly the situation, although it is notable, I think, that in Sitka, it's the Blue Lake Dam project is
Mhm.
bonded them to the hilt, it seems. They're leveraged up to their
Yeah.
eyeballs
Yeah.
in borrowing for this dam project, which would provide hydroelectricity, which is great, particularly for a petro state like Alaska. But it's not clear that they're going to have as much breathing room for the spendable money as they would want, that money might go to the dam rather than the schools. And when you're talking about trade-offs, I think particularly socialists, and leftists who are coming, they don't think in terms of trade-offs. Maybe they think
Yes.
about like, they think what we can win. They think what people deserve. They think that what the state should do. But in
Mhm.
terms of the subnational context, even in the federal, where you have to do politics to how to unlock the dollar that's printed by the government, like you are going to have to do trade-offs. Like if you want to do an
Yes.
electric dam, but also your public schools are having problems, you only have a set amount of money. I mean, now the ways in which we should approach ideologically and imagine the different kinds of monies that we have when we have them should be
Yeah.
totally different. But the trade-off is still there, and
Yeah. The
this
fact that
exists in
there's still
Sitka.
like a rock and a hard place, or like there's pros and cons to doing either of these things, and they might be mutually exclusive. That remains extremely real. What you said earlier, I want to come back to the idea of what to do with the permanent fund dividend, how it's supporting homeschooling, tie it back into recent Alaska politics, and then also bring it back into the way that education in particular creates these strange bedfellows, particularly
Yeah.
around issues of privatization generally. So in my understanding, and I am very open to correction here, something like that specific move with respect to increasing the share of the dividend for homeschoolers, and which means decreasing the share that's going to public schools, was part of the rationale for the governor continuing to veto upward adjustments of that state level allocation thing. That was, he wanted to tie an upward adjustment to basically a greater portion
greater
of
dividend.
a greater dividend, or at least a greater portion of whatever funding is dedicated to education flowing out to homeschoolers, to choice, to parental
Yeah.
right type stuff in general. The legislature obviously didn't have enough votes to override the veto, but there's still, I mean, everybody that we're talking about is a Republican base. It's like it's one
It's
part.
all Republicans. Yeah.
It's all Republicans, but there's disagreement within this. And again, having spent time in conservative think tank spaces, people talk very explicitly about like this divide within conservative ideology between like sort of a libertarian individualist conservatism and a
Yeah.
communitarian conservatism. And that is what
Right.
we're seeing in the strange bedfellows here. And I want to say that the same divide basically also occurs on the left between a more like libertarian leftism and a more sort of solidaristic leftism. And this is partly why, in US politics anyway, Democrats for education reform, for instance, is much more of like an individualistic, neoliberal, like form of like center leftism that can make common cause with certain libertarian shades of conservatism and like push charter schools as a broad salve for, an otherwise failing social safety net or a way of generating individual human capital or whatever. But the same odd coalition is capable of forming in the other direction on the more communitarian side, where, for instance, all of these rural school like communities that are tied together by their public schools are not. It is just so odd to see like the governor of Alaska pushing school choice when the vast majority of the people in his state would not have choices to choose among.
How can you choose if you don't have if there's nothing to choose from?
And it's one of these examples of sort of a large scale partisan policy prescription running aground, as you said earlier, on sort of the lived reality of how people that are members of that party actually live their lives. And rural communities in general, tied together with their schools, the school is really substantially locally controlled and is a thing that people are on board with. And if you have state level politicians who are coming down being like, actually, why don't you have a voucher, for instance? Like that doesn't play as well politically as, like state level or presidential level vote share would lead you to believe that it might.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and maybe this is a good note to end on, but there's a sort of solace in the ideology of individualism. There's a comfort that comes from just being like, everyone should just do their own thing. Like we can't do this together, and I'm thinking of this wonderful moment. I'm a sort of slightly secretive celeb news gossip follower, and there was this great moment when Cole Escola, who wrote "Oh Mary," this amazing play on Broadway, was asked about a particular like Broadway kind of controversy at that moment. I can't remember who it was involving, but they asked Cole, oh, what do you think about this gossip? And Cole like sort of looked at this grin on their face and said, I think we should leave it to the states. And, it's this wonderful joke about federalism in the sense that you just throw up your hands and say, you do you. And I don't have to worry about it. But also what happens when we want to take care of each other. And, these conservatives are really struggling with this right now. They're trying to figure out how to be trad cath and how to like think that they can take care of something like the nation while also basically inhabiting the sort of dying body of this neoliberal, neoconservative kind of structure that really just wants everyone to be on their own all the time and have a ruling class that just makes the decision. To some degree, I think they resolve it through like this kind of almost neo-feudal, kind of neo-fascist try to reclaiming of like monarchies and kings and, but yeah, that's a tangent we can pick up in other threads.
Yes. I hope that we have adequately covered the things that are going on in Sitka. It looks bad in the short term, as I imagine this is going to be a theme on this show in general. It's going to be hard to get out of this situation. It's not going to be easy to do without pain, maybe even beyond the 4.25 FTE that has already been
Sorry to that
shed.
quarter teacher.
Yeah, right.
But it's not, some situations you have to have perspective. You have to index the sort of effectivity of what's going on. And it's like, what's going on in Jackson County, Missouri right now, for instance, is not what's happening here. This is not an existential situation like it is there. Not many things I've seen are going on like what's going on in Missouri, but more and more we're going to have to figure out, what's existential and what isn't. I think Sitka is going to make it.
I think Sitka's going to make it. We're going to have to work out what is existential and what's not. And that is going to have to happen, or I would love to see this happen against a background of like, what do we want? What, like broadly speaking, we at every level in terms of an education system that we can all live with. And especially when it comes to like what that would cost. Like I think about the difference between, Hickman Mills is getting screwed in literally 3 ways in a way that, could end the district. Sitka is going through a much more ordinary round of pain, but it's ordinary because it's so widespread. And one of the things, I was just going back and doing, I was researching referendum passages in my home state of Wisconsin because I wanted to tie those to actual sort of outcomes. I did this for the super nerds out there. I did basically an event study, a regression discontinuity analysis where I was just looking
those discontinuities.
I was looking specifically at operating referendums. So referendums meant to not for building, just for maintaining operational stuff. And I was going back to 2013. I was limiting myself to ones that had a vote share of support between 48 and 52%. So I'm trying to look right at the boundary of like what passes and what doesn't.
That's what you got to do. The discontinuity is what happens at the boundaries. Yeah.
The assumption being that like the vibes in the community, even though these projects are very different, even though these communities are different, even though they have different histories, are going to be about the same. It's about like half level of support. And therefore, like the inference that that I am licensing myself to make is like what happens after the fact is the result of the referendum either passing or failing. And counterintuitively, one of the things that I found is that passage is associated with staff cuts, generally not teachers, but there is like a negative coefficient. And my theory on that is essentially that like,
wait, this is a bond referendum?
What? No, these are operating, budget referendums.
Operating referendum. Okay, yeah.
My theory is that enough of these, so like districts in Wisconsin, you can go to a vote in like November if there's a state. You can only run these referendums on the ballot when it's a statewide election of any kind. And so like if you go on a presidential election in November and then there's a primary or a primary election the following April, you can go back. You can like ask for an operational referendum, fail, and then go back the following year for an operational referendum again. My theory is that at these boundaries, very often districts are having to make bargains with their taxpayers. Like, we will reduce expenditures by this much if you just pass the bill. We're not going to ask you for the full amount that we need to actually maintain what we're doing. We're going to ask you for slightly less so that we can continue to fund the things that you prioritize and make cuts in these ways that we prescribe. And would
it's always the poor staff, the people in the district office. And I bet they're just coming in and going all the time. It's like, oh, well, we got to furlough you. It's like a furlough, basically. It's a furlough of convenience to try to get through the next budget cycle so that you can get the community approval for your operating budget.
But that would be in the event of a failure. With failures, teachers and staff are getting cut. But even when
you're saying you pass
staff, yes, I'm saying that basically some districts get to yes by being like, we are going to reduce our expenditures if you just by some amount if you say yes to a larger amount.
And we'll cut our own staff. Wow.
That is a bargain that I see districts making a lot. And this is all to say that the way that those conversations play out is not a good way to have a conversation about what we want our schools to do. It's about a minimal amount that we can live with for now. It's like, that is tied to like how much we're willing to pay in property taxes.
It's so dumb. Is that just in Wisconsin, or is that?
That I've only looked at Wisconsin so far.
Just in Wisconsin. Interesting. Okay. Yeah. Cool. Well, I think we did it.
I think we did it. This is going to be a good closing line for us. I think we did it.
I guess so. Yeah. It feels like I pay attention to what it feels like, and when I'm teaching in class, I'm like, sometimes it's before class ends, and I'm like, you know what? That's it.
Yeah, that's it. I'll see you next time.